Your just check it.
Good morning. A warm welcome to one and all. The Department of Political Science, St. Aloysius College, Mangalore, is collaborating with Nehru Study Center of Mangalore University, which has envisioned a project entitled Multi Ways of Imagining India. Multi Ways of Imagining India is a series of online academic presentations on a set of thinkers of the 19th and the 20th century India. Professor Vinay Lal's presentation is first among these. The eminent historian and Gandhi scholar, Professor Vinay Lal, University of California, Los Angeles,
Start again, please.
good morning. Good morning. A warm welcome to one and all. The Department of Political Science, St. Aloysius College, Mangaluru, is collaborating with Nehru Study Center of Mangalore University, which has envisioned a project entitled Multi Ways of Imagining India. Multi Ways of Imagining India is a series of online academic presentations on a set of thinkers of the 19th and the 20th century. Professor Vinay Lal's presentation is first among these. The eminent historian and Gandhi scholar, Professor Vinay Lal, University of California, Los Angeles, will make the thematic presentation on Gandhi and ethics of nursing, a pedagogy in times of coronavirus. Before we formally inaugurate the program, Dr. Divya Shetty, Assistant Professor at PG Department of Chemistry, will invoke the rendition Vaishnava Janato, accompanied by Mr. Ruben Machado, Assistant Professor, Department of Journalism on the flute. The director in charge, Professor Rajaram Tolpadi, Nehru Study Center, Mangalore University, will formally welcome the eminent scholar and all the participants of this program.
Good morning. Good morning, and good evening to Vinay Lal over there in US. I'm extremely delighted to welcome you all to this very important seminar, rather webinar on Mahatma Gandhi. This is a very ambitious project that Nehru Study Center has envisioned for this entire year and also to the next year. So we would actually start this program today, and we hope to continue this until next October 2021. We have chosen over 25 very eminent Indians on which different scholars will be making their presentations at different points in time. In this context, I I think we have with us a very eminent scholar on Gandhi, and I cannot think of anyone else but Professor Vinay Lal to make a presentation on Gandhi, particularly on a topic which I think is very crucial today. The coronavirus and the kind of ethics required in the context of coronavirus. I'm extremely pleased to have Professor Vinay Lal here for our webinar. I'm welcoming him to this webinar. I'm again very delighted to have our Vice Chancellor, Professor P.S. Edapaditaya, who has been very affectionate and very helpful, in terms of organizing different kinds of programs that Nehru Study Center has been organizing for the last 3 years. I think I should say that he has given me absolute freedom in organizing whatever I wish to organize in terms of Nehru Study Center. And this kind of a freedom has actually enabled me to envision different kinds of basically academic programs for the last 2 years, and I hope to continue it in the coming years as well. I'm welcoming Professor P.S. Edapaditaya, our Vice Chancellor, for this webinar. I'm also very thankful, and I welcome Professor Father Pradeep Martis, the principal of Aloysius College, who he has accepted to collaborate with us, and he has also accepted to be the president of this program. And he has always been very helpful in whatever programs that Nehru Study Center has been doing for the last 2-3 years. I welcome you, sir. I should also make mention of my registrar, Raju Mogavira, who has been very friendly and very helpful in organizing programs. I'm not very sure whether he will be part of this program today, but then in absentia, he has been very helpful to me in organizing this. If 2 or 3, quick remarks, because I think all of us are very eager to listen to Vinay Lal. I don't want to waste much time, but I want to make this occasion, put my ideas, very quickly. One is that Nehru Study Center, although is named after Nehru, it is not Nehru centric. It wants to go beyond Nehru and incorporate different ideological aspects, not only of Indian politics, but also of global politics. And that therefore, there has to be a certain intellectual open-mindedness to include different kinds of voices, different kinds of ideological perspectives, into Nehru Study Center, and make Nehru Study Center a very contemporary kind of a platform, a contemporary kind of an academic platform, which does not close itself to any kind of ideological perspective. But the point is that this is an academic platform, and it wants to keep the critical faculty, open, and that all kinds of ideas should come into this. And this is actually the Gandhian message that let all ideas come to us. But we should be firm in terms of where we stand and what we want. So it is in that spirit, in that Gandhian spirit of open-endedness, I think we are organizing all our programs, and particularly this particular series of lectures on the 19th and 20th century intellectual history of India. And our choice has also been very diverse, and we have tried to include different national and regional thinkers into this fold, so that we will be able to have a very enriched kind of idea of India, very pluralistic, multicultural idea of India, which I think is the most important requirement of our time. By saying this, I want to close, and I welcome all the dignitaries here, my Vice Chancellor, Principal, Registrar, and all the dignitaries, friends, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The series of multi-ways of imagining India will be formally inaugurated by the Vice Chancellor of Mangalore University, Professor P.S. Yadapaditaya. I request Sir to deliver us his inaugural address.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. At the very outset, let me offer greetings from Mangalore University. Dear Professor Vinay Lal, the main speaker of today's international webinar, Father Praveen Martis, the principal of St. Aloysius College Autonomous, Mangalore, my colleagues, friends, and other dignitaries participating in this international webinar on Mahatma Gandhi. At the very outset, let me say that I am pleased to inaugurate this important event organized jointly by Nehru Study Center, Mangalore University and St. Aloysius College Autonomous, Mangalore. Nehru Study Center, Mangalore University has been established by the government of Karnataka. It is an academic platform organizing divergent kinds of programs involving teachers, students, and communities of people in and around Mangalore. The objectives of the center are not just confined to popularize the ideas and concerns of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru alone. Instead, it wishes to go beyond Nehru in regenerating sensitivities towards normative issues of Indian politics among people. In other words, Nehru Study Center is constantly engaged with evolving critical perspectives on Indian history, society, and politics. As part of this engagement, the center is organizing a series of webinars on the intellectual history of modern India. We find it apt to begin our intellectual journey with M.K. Gandhi, called as Mahatma in reverence and Bapu in affection by all of us. Who else would be the most appropriate person to speak on Gandhi than Professor Vinay Lal? Professor Vinay Lal has been an eminent historian and prolific scholar on Gandhi. We are greatly honored to have him with us today. He is going to speak to us on Gandhi and the ethics of nursing, a pedagogy of care in times of coronavirus. This, I think, is the most relevant theme for our time. I wish to remind you, this is just a beginning. We are going to have such intellectually stimulating presentations throughout this year and next year as well. I'm very happy to inaugurate this endeavor and believe that this will help us in evolving a critical and enriching perspective on India. Let me also thank the principal and the management of St. Aloysius College for extending their helping hand in organizing many of our programs, including this. I wish this international webinar on Mahatma Gandhi a grand success, and it creates not only heat, but also light in the form of fruitful discussions and deliberations. My hearty congratulations to Professor Rajarama Tolpadi and the principal of St. Aloysius College Autonomous and their team. Thank you very much for your time and opportunity. Good luck to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I request the president of today's program, Reverend Dr. Praveen Martis, SJ, principal of St. Aloysius College, to give us his presidential message.
Respected Professor Vinay Lal, eminent historian and Gandhian scholar, University of California, Los Angeles, Professor P.S. Yadapaditaya, the Vice Chancellor, Mangalore University, Professor Rajaram Tolpadi, the Director in charge, Nehru Study Center, Mangalore University, Dr. Rosevira, Dean of Arts Faculty and the HOD of Political Science Department, St. Aloysius College, dignitaries, my dear members of the faculty, and my dear participants. It's a joyous occasion to have the international webinar on Mahatma Gandhi, Gandhi and Ethics of Nursing, a Pedagogy of Care in Times of Coronavirus. It is jointly organized by the Mangalore University, Nehru Study Center, and St. Aloysius College, Autonomous Mangalore, the Department of Political Science. We have been organizing series of lectures in the past too, and we are delighted to join hands with the Nehru Study Center, Mangalore University, to organize series of lectures. And today's is the beginning, the first lecture that we have, and it is apt to begin the lecture series with Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma, as you all know, the person who truly stood by his words. Someone asked him to give the message because he could not come and attend the program. Then Mahatma Gandhi seems to have said, "My life is my message." Truly, Mahatma has inspired all of us, not only our country, but he has inspired the people from all over the world. And today we begin this series to talk on Mahatma Gandhi, at times of COVID-19, when we are all struggling. I could say this is a time of challenges and opportunity, times where we truly struggle, there are still uncertainties. And at this time, Mahatma Gandhi would definitely inspire us. He's a man of love, man of inclusiveness, man of hope, and man of coexistence. Apart from non-violence, he taught us to live in harmony. Man who truly propagated pluralism and also multicultural way of living. As we begin this wonderful webinar on Mahatma Gandhi, I would like to once again thank Professor P.S. Edapadithaya, the Vice Chancellor of Mangalore University, and Professor Rajaram Tolpadi, the Director in charge of Nehru Study Center, for including us and also for jointly organizing this wonderful international webinar on Mahatma Gandhi. I thank everyone, and I hope that this international webinar on Mahatma Gandhi will be an enriching one, where we truly engage ourselves in deliberations and discussions, and it might help us to truly take the idea of India forward. Thank you. God bless us all.
Thank you, Father. I
It is my proud privilege to introduce the distinguished speaker of this webinar, Professor Vinay Lal. Professor Vinay Lal is a well-known cultural critic, writer, blogger, and professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. His intellectual and research interests include South Asian history, comparative colonial histories, the Indian diaspora, public and popular culture in India, cinema, cultures of sexuality, the global histories of non-violence, and the thought of Mahatma Gandhi. All of his works are deeply permeated by an awareness of the politics of knowledge systems and the desire to strive for the ecological survival of plurality. His 17 authored and edited books include the 2-volume Oxford Anthology of the Modern Indian City, published by Oxford in 2013, Diwar, The Footpath, The City, and The Angry Young Man, published by HarperCollins in 2011, Political Hinduism, published by Oxford in 2009, Of Cricket, Guinness and Gandhi, published by Penguin in 2005, The History of History, published by Oxford in 2003, and the two books co-edited with Ashish Nandi. He is a founding member of the Blackwaters Collective on Metaphysics and Politics and editor of the book series emerging from the collective, most recently, India and Civilizational Futures, published by Oxford 2019. Professor Vinay Lal's scholarly work has been translated into several Indian languages and other languages for French, German, Spanish, Finnish, Korean, Persian, and his shorter essays and popular writings have been translated into some 40 languages, including Portuguese, Ukrainian, Slovak, Russian, Bosnian, Polish, Greek, etc. His works in progress include a book on the history of colonial India, told through stories, a study of internet Hinduism, and two books of Indian nationalism and visual imaginary. A two-volume collection of his essays on Gandhi will be published by Orient Black Swan in mid-2021. Professor Vinay Lal, we are truly delighted to have you with us today. St. Aloysius College and Nehru Study Center takes pride in organizing this particular webinar. Over to you, Professor Vinay Lal, for your address. Your address will be followed by the question answer sessions. I request the participants to put up their questions in the chat box, and our team at St. Aloysius College will monitor and help in the interactive session. Thank you very much once again, and over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor D'Souza, for your introduction. Let me begin by acknowledging my thanks to St. Aloysius College, the Department of Political Science, as well as to, of course, the Nehru Study Center at Mangalore University. And in particular, my thanks to Professor Rajaram Tolpade for his kind invitation to be the first speaker in this, as he has pointed out, very ambitious series of lectures on the principal figures, or some of the principal figures of the 19th and 20th century in India. So the title of my talk has been mentioned 4 times already, so I'm not going to mention it now myself. It is going to be a talk on Gandhi and nursing. But before I begin my formal talk, which has been written up as a paper, and there's a very small portion of this, which is appearing in a book, which will be published next week. It's a book I wrote over 45 days of the summer on the coronavirus. But it's not a scientific account of it because I'm not a scientist. I'm someone who works in political theory, cultural history, what I've called the politics of knowledge system. So it's basically a book on the politics and cultural histories of pandemics, and in particular this pandemic in the midst of which we are placed right now. And I have to say, I mean, I'm prepared to answer any questions about the coronavirus pandemic in general later on, if someone should have any, although this talk is really not on the pandemic, except that it is on the ethics of how to look after people, the ethics of healing, the ethics of nursing, and what insights Gandhi brings to it. But I have to say that this particular pandemic is in fact actually unprecedented. We don't have any example of something of this kind in history. Those of you who are historians might raise your eyebrows and say, well, that's impossible because there's always a precedent for everything. If historians didn't have a precedent, they'd be out of a job. But this, in fact, actually is unprecedented because we do not have on record the kind of state intervention and the level of state intervention globally that we have had in this pandemic. There was a very big pandemic in 1957, one in 1968. Both of them led to at least 1 million dead in both of them. Neither of them even made it to the history books. You'd be astonished to know that, right? And one of the reasons they didn't is because they didn't have the kind of level of state intervention that we've seen in this particular pandemic. But anyhow, this is not really the subject of the talk. I only mentioned this in the context because once the pandemic started unfolding, as someone who has worked on Gandhi and who's also a cultural historian, the question naturally really came to me, and many people started asking me the question, what would Gandhi have said or done in these times? Right? How might he have reacted, for example, to some of the questions that have really come about as a consequence of the situation in which we have all been placed, where travel globally has become nearly impossible. I myself have a mother who lives in Gurgaon, and generally I visit her 4 times a year, and I haven't been able to visit her since January, and the likelihood is that I'm not going to be able to go if I want to ensure her safety and my safety and the safety of many others until probably several months from now, and perhaps not even as early as mid-2021. As the epidemiologists say, when you've seen one pandemic, you've only seen one. You haven't seen, if there's a pandemic 20 years from now, it's not certain that the experience of this pandemic will necessarily be very useful. It may be, it may not be, right? But the other fundamental question, and this is all by way of a preface, because I haven't gotten into the substantive nature of my remarks here. The other fundamental question that I want to think about, and I'd invite you to think about with me, is how does one think of nonviolence in these times? And in particularly in respect to the coronavirus, because of course there is an occasion to think about nonviolence globally today. My own personal view of the matter, some of you may not share that view, and there may be disagreement about it. But my own view of the matter is that we are slowly creeping towards totalitarianism in many parts of the world. I won't specify all the list of countries where that's happening, but it's certainly happening in the United States, where I am at the moment. And it's certainly happening in our part of the world and in many other parts of the world as well, right? The question now is, why is it that we always think of nonviolence to the extent that we think of it at all? Because frankly, I don't really think that we think about it very much. But when we do think about it, it's always in the context of conflict. So for example, if you look at the second half of the 20th century, after the assassination of Gandhi on 30th January 1948, if you take the next 50 years, we see that when we think of Gandhi's legacy, who are we thinking of? We're thinking of Nelson Mandela and the people who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, Oliver Tambo, Ahmed Kathrada, many others. We are thinking of Aung San Suu Kyi. I know, of course, that now she is discredited, but all of you should remember that 10 years ago, she was a heroic figure in the eyes of the whole world. Right? And we think, of course, preeminently of the civil rights movement in the United States, where every major civil rights leader was deeply steeped in the writings, thought, and philosophy of Gandhi. Every single major figure in the civil rights movement, without the shadow of a doubt. And then we think of, let's say, someone like the Dalai Lama. But if you take these 4 examples, you see that we are already thinking of nonviolence in the context of conflict. For Mohandas Gandhi, nonviolence was a way of being in the world. It was not simply a mode of resistance to colonialism. It was not simply a mode of resistance to oppressions within Indian society. It was all of that. I'm not saying it wasn't that, but what I'm simply suggesting is that nonviolence was completely a part of his way of being in the world. It was inescapably intertwined with every action and thought of his life. So what does it mean to lead a non-violent life, right? And this in turn means that, for example, we can think not only of not committing violence, and when I say violence here, I don't mean simply physical violence, because violence takes many forms. If parents speak very, very loudly all the time to their children, or if a man abuses his wife, right? Not necessarily physically, but even in other respects, simply by being disrespectful. All of these, and multitudes of other ways, all of these are forms of violence, right? So we are enjoined, when we think of nonviolence, we are enjoined to think about what we should not do, right? And we can think in English of acts of omission and acts of commission, right? What we should not do and what we should do. What would be our responsibility if we were trying to lead a life of nonviolence? Uh, in Indian thought, the categories you could use would be yam and niyam, right? The social restraints and the self-disciplines, things that one should not do, things that one should abstain from, but also things that one should try to do. It is in this context that I want to explore the whole idea of Gandhi as a figure of nursing. And when we think about Gandhi, at least to someone like me who's been thinking about Gandhi since I finished high school over 40 years ago, there is no question in my mind that Gandhi is a fount that can never be exhausted. In almost every domain of life, he has something to tell us, right? And it so turns out that he actually does have a lot to tell us about the ethics of nursing. Now, of course, it is the case, to move into my formal remarks now, it is the case, of course, that he does not occupy any place in the histories of nursing in India. If you picked up let's say, an article or a book on the history of nursing in India, you would find Gandhi barely even mentioned, all right? But it should come as no surprise, of course, to you, given what I've already said, or if you have reflected on his long career as perhaps the principal exponent in history, in world history, of the idea of nonviolence, that Gandhi displayed a great affinity for nursing and thought of it as a noble way of rendering service to humankind. Ahimsa for him is nothing but love, a mode of ministering to the soul and nursing the wounds of others, as well as those which are self-inflicted. Yet Gandhi also had, we should acknowledge, a withering critique, a devastating critique of modern medicine and doctors. A critique that, as you can well expect, does not sit well with the medical profession, although it is notable that this critique did not extend to nursing. He took a very different view of nursing itself, right? And I also say this with the full awareness of the fact that his thoughts on nursing, which I've hinted at, but I'm putting it in a different way now, do not actually conform to the textbook prescriptions of nursing. So why is it that he had a critique of modern medicine? He viewed modern medicine as animated by the evil of vivisection and plagued by the profit motive, but his critique of it has other socio-ethical, political, and philosophical dimensions that are far beyond the scope of the present paper. And here I would recommend to those of you who are seriously interested in looking at an epistemological critique of modern Western medicine to take a look at an extraordinary paper that was published about 35 years ago by Ashish Nandi and Shiv Vishwanathan, his colleague at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, published in a book called Dominating Knowledges. And the article is called Modern Medicine and Its Non-Modern Critics, right? And a portion of that paper is devoted to the views of Gandhi. Not the entire paper, just a very small portion of the paper. Now, in his 1909 treatise, Hind Swaraj on Indian Home Rule, which is increasingly being viewed as the most fundamental expression of his ideas, although it does not have the kind of traction that his autobiography still has. In this work, his critique of the figure of the doctor we find is fundamentally rooted in his deep suspicion of what he calls the third party. All right. So I'm also offering some of you who may be familiar with Hind Swaraj, and for those of you who are not, I would advise you to really become familiar with it, because if there's one Indian text, modern Indian text, that I think we should know, that every Indian should know, I think it's unquestionably Hind Swaraj. But in this particular work, if you know the structure of it, so he has long chapters on Hindu-Muslim unity or disunity in the present times. He has chapters on the railways, on doctors, on lawyers. And one of the things that is common to all of these is his critique of what I'm calling, based on Gandhi's own idea, of the third party. Just as lawyers come between two adversaries and only profit themselves, so the lawyer is the third party, right? And just as the British drove a wedge between the Hindus and the Muslims and set themselves up as a transcendent peacekeeper, so the doctor appeared to Gandhi as someone who distances the patient from his or her own body. Right? Gandhi's claim is that modern medicine and the doctor, who is the embodiment of that system, actually prevents the patient from knowing his or her own body. And so therefore, the doctor is now the third party, that is the person who comes between the patient and the body. Right? He imagines the circumstances under which a visit to a doctor becomes necessary. And I quote him here, quote, "I have indulged in vice. I contract a disease. A doctor cures me, the odds are that I shall repeat the vice. The odds are that I shall repeat the vice. Had the doctor not intervened, nature would have done its work and I would have acquired mastery over myself, would have been freed from vice and would have become happy," end quote. Now, happy is not what, of course, others have been with Gandhi's critique of modern medicine and its practitioners. And many have dismissed Hind Swaraj, and certainly his critique of railways, hospitals, and the legal profession as an ill-informed diatribe. At that time itself, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, whom Gandhi greatly admired and whom he considered one of his several mentors, one of his many mentors, Gokhale was very embarrassed by this work, and he said it's going to go into the dustbin of history. Right? However, Gandhi's position on modern medicine is easily mischaracterized. In accepting an invitation to inaugurate the opening of a medical college, that is Tibia College, in Delhi in 1921, Gandhi offered what he called, quote, his humble tribute to the spirit of research that fires the modern scientist, while adding this proviso: "My quarrel is not against that spirit. My complaint is against the direction that the spirit has taken. It has chiefly concerned itself with the exploration of laws and methods conducing to the merely material advancement of its clientele," end quote. It is not without reluctance that he accepted the invitation. And the invitation, incidentally, to him comes because originally it was going to be the viceroy who had been offered the invitation to inaugurate the college. But then in 1921, for those of you who remember, that this became the height of the non-cooperation movement, which Gandhi had launched in 1920, and which he was going to suspend in 1922 after the incident of Chowri Chowra. But this was the height of it. So obviously at that time, would have been very awkward for the viceroy to come. And so in place of the viceroy, it was Gandhi who was invited, right? But he says that his reluctance to accept this invitation comes from the fact that he wants his audience to know that I hold strange views on medicine and hospitals and have scrupulously avoided any special contact with such institutions, end quote. And yet, as he told a German visitor who met with him in 1937, so this is 16 years later, he did not, quote, despise all medical treatment, did not. I know we can learn a lot from the West about safe maternity and the care of infants, end quote. If then his outlook on medicine still remains unacceptable to many, on the question of nursing, however, he adopted views that may be rather more agreeable and even admirable to most people, most particularly at this time of the coronavirus pandemic, when healthcare practitioners are being celebrated the world over as frontline workers who have put their lives at risk. He might have thought, incidentally, that the effortless ease with which we have all fallen into speaking of the front line suggests the extent to which we have unthinkingly absorbed the vocabulary of war into our thinking. Even if he would have understood the spirit in which we have been all called to recognize and applaud the altruistic behavior of those, particularly nurses, who have become part of the course of essential workers. Indeed, it is not too much to say, as shall become apparent in due course, that he thought of nurses, not doctors, as essential. And in this respect, he seems to be characteristically contrarian in his thinking, very unconventional in his thinking. Now, at the time that Gandhi transitioned into adulthood, one name entirely dominated the public perception of nursing, at least in the Anglophone world and the British Empire. And that one name, some of you might have suspected, is Florence Nightingale. Gandhi himself penned a tribute to her in Gujarati in his newspaper, Indian Opinion, which he had established in South Africa. And of course, at this time, he was living in South Africa, several years before her death in August 1910. This piece actually dates to 1905, the tribute that he writes to Florence Nightingale. Though it is a short piece, it is vintage Gandhi and deserving of a much lengthier commentary than I am able to offer at the present moment. Now, some of the language is characteristic of the writing where he speaks of those whom he views as pious and selfless. Quote, there were in those days very few men who considered it an act of mercy and merit to succor the wounded. It was at such a time that this lady, Florence Nightingale, came upon the scene and did good work worthy of an angel descended from heaven, end quote. This is what I mean by that language of, where he's describing someone who's pious and selfless. He describes how through the selfless care of the wounded British soldiers at Scutari, so this is, in the Ottoman Empire, I mean, actually not far from Istanbul or Constantinople, as it used to be called, right? And this is in the context of what is called the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. Nightingale and the nurses trained under her immediately brought the mortality rate. When she went over with a group of nurses, they brought the mortality rate among the wounded down to 31% from 42% and eventually to 5%. I just want to pause here a second. I want you to think about the staggering mortality rate among the wounded, right? Before she comes there, 42%, right? That was the mortality rate among the wounded. Right? I mean, you think, for example, let's take something like the Vietnam War, which the United States fought over several years and where they lost 57,000 soldiers, but the number of soldiers who were wounded was well over 1.5 million, right? So the mortality rate of the wounded is minuscule in comparison. And one of the reasons why the mortality rate of the wounded has come down is, of course, because of professional nursing and the kinds of regimens of nursing that became introduced. But he loses, in this piece, he loses neither the opportunity to castigate the British government, which he says was as usual, not alive to the situation. That is, that they were dreaming, they were unaware of what was really happening, right? And they really didn't care about their men, right? When war first broke out in Crimea, and he loses neither this opportunity to castigate the British nor to press forward with his own homilies on what might be viewed as the basic principles of nursing. Though the results Nightingale produced were miraculous, he says, they can be easily visualized. If bleeding could be stopped, the wounds bandaged, and the requisite diet given, the lives of many thousands would doubtless be saved. And it's very interesting, actually, the words that he uses, because he says it's a matter of, cleaning the wounds, taking the bandages and putting them on the wounds properly, right? And providing adequate care, diet. And that's really the fundamentals of nursing, right? The only thing necessary, I'm quoting him now, was kindness, which Miss Nightingale provided, end quote. Now, there is nothing on record to suggest that Gandhi had read Nightingale's short manual, Notes on Nursing, published in 1860. Towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to have a very, very short PowerPoint presentation where I'll show you 5 or 6 images, and I'll show you the image of this book of this as well. But there can be little doubt that he would have been in agreement with the most fundamental propositions of this book. And I'm quoting Florence Nightingale here now, quote, the very elements of what constitutes good nursing are as little understood for the well as for the sick. The same laws of health or of nursing, for they are in reality the same, obtain among the well as among the sick, end quote. Nevertheless, in the matter of nursing, I want to say to you, as in most other domains of life, Gandhi was essentially self-taught. So he knew about Florence Nightingale, but he hadn't read her manual. He hadn't attended a nursing school. He had never probably even really met a nurse, for all I know, right, at this point in time. When he was 16 years old, he nursed his father, who was then suffering from a fistula and was confined to the bed. So, sores basically. And Gandhi talks about this in his own autobiography. I had the duties of a nurse, Gandhi recalled many years later in his autobiography, which mainly consisted in dressing the wound, giving my father his medicine, and compounding drugs whenever they had to be made up at home. Every night, Gandhi massaged his father's legs. I love to do this service. I do not remember ever having neglected it. But then came what Gandhi himself called the dreadful night. Overtaken by the carnal urge, Gandhi left his father's bedside to share the bed with his wife Kasturba, to whom he was married when both were 13 years old. He had been with her for all of 5 minutes when a knock came on the door. He opens the door, the servant announces, your father has expired. In the centenary year of Gandhi's birth, in 1969, that is, in an influential book called Gandhi's Truth on the Origins of Militant Nonviolence, Erik Erikson would go on to argue controversially that this incident and Gandhi's guilt over it exercised an incalculable influence on his life. This is not to say that I necessarily agree, but this was an argument made by Erik Erikson. Whatever the merits of Erikson's view, Gandhi's interest in nursing can be traced to this incident. There would be other occasions far too numerous to enumerate where Gandhi would find the opportunity to nurture his instinct for nursing within the ambit of the larger extended family. So just as Gandhi learned about Satyagraha at home, we should always remember that. Because when we think of Satyagraha, we think of the anti-colonial movement. And Gandhi says, I learned about all of these things at home, and I generally learned about them from my mother, right? And it is within the ambit of the family first, the extended family here now, that Gandhi really becomes a nurse first, right? So after his father, now I'm moving to the next set of incidents. Gandhi found himself in Bombay in 1896. Now, at this point in time, he was actually living in South Africa, but he was returning to India every now and then. I can't get into the history of all of those occasions. But in 1896, Bombay was being decimated by bubonic plague. And he chose to spend day and night by the bedside of his brother-in-law, who had taken seriously ill, and whose own wife, that is Gandhi's sister, was not equal to nursing him. Gandhi could not save his life. However, as he was to write years later in his autobiography, my aptitude for nursing gradually developed into a passion. So much so that it often led me to neglect my work. And on occasions, I engaged not only my wife, but the whole household in such service. End quote. In 1918, when Gandhi was struck by the in 1918, when India was struck by the so-called Spanish flu, that is an influenza of 1918-20, which, let me advise all of you, in case you're not aware of it, that according to modern scholarly studies, killed 50 to 100 million people around the globe. And you have to remember that the population of the world at that time was 2 billion, right? And 50 to 100 million is an astronomical number. Remember that the coronavirus now has killed 1 million, but the population of the world is 8 billion, almost 8 billion today. So it's so the number of people lost today thus far is a minuscule fraction of the number of people who were killed during the Spanish flu. And of that 50 to 100 million, it is estimated that at least 15 million died in India, at least 15 million, possibly as many as 18 million, especially if you include the so-called native or princely states, all right? So in 1918, when India was struck by the so-called Spanish flu, Gandhi was taken seriously ill. Some have thought that he too had been afflicted with that malignant influenza, and Laura Spinney, in her recent book called Pale Fire, also argues that, but she's entirely incorrect. I can say that with confidence because Gandhi did not have the Spanish flu or the influenza. And there are a number of sources which make that very clear. And in fact, the doctor tells him that you're just suffering from a nervous breakdown due to extreme weakness. These are the words in the autobiography. Though Gandhi remained free of infection, his own nearness to death was brought home to him by the fact that he had lost his grandson, Shantilal, as well as his own daughter-in-law, Gulab, to the plague. To the extent that scholars have paid any attention whatsoever to Gandhi's lifelong passion for nursing among a wider public, now moving outside the ambit of the home and the family, the narrative generally begins with his initiative in setting up an Indian ambulance corps, consisting of 1,100 volunteers during the Boer War in South Africa in 1899. We must recall that Gandhi had made South Africa his home and he spent 20 years there before returning to India for good in January 1915. The South African years are vitally important. More particularly if we consider that Gandhi had acquired experience of nursing under conditions of a pneumonic plague epidemic, which somewhat resonate with the contemporary experience of COVID-19. In 1904, as he details in his book Satyagraha in South Africa, published in 1928, which recounts the struggle waged by Indians in South Africa to oppose racism and gain political recognition, Gandhi was settled in the Johannesburg area at this time, where he had established a law practice. Early that year, he was to write, "A virulent plague broke out among the Indians in Johannesburg. I was fully engaged in nursing the patients." He describes his own contribution modestly. However, the autobiography offers a somewhat more detailed account in 2 short chapters entitled The Black Plague I and The Black Plague II. Gandhi and his friends took possession of a vacant house by breaking in its locks, and shifted 23 Indians suffering from the scourge, nursing them through the night. Let me just explain a little bit the context here so you understand. So in Johannesburg, South Africa, incidentally, at that point in time, I'm using the word a little anachronistically, just a little bit, because the Union of South Africa only came about in 1905. So what you had provinces. So you had, for example, the Cape, you had Natal, which is where actually Indians had first gone as indentured laborers. And of course, not all Indians went as indentured laborers. In South Africa, we can make a distinction between those Indians who went as indentured laborers. They were also known by the derogatory word coolie. And then there were those Indians who paid their own way because they went there as merchants, for example, which is how Gandhi arrived there, not as a merchant, but he was invited by Baba Abdullah, whose family was from Porbandar. And Gandhi was invited to South Africa because Baba Abdullah needed a lawyer to help him with his work, okay, in that part of what then became in 1905 South Africa, the Union of South Africa. Right? And in Johannesburg, the Indians were living in a part of town which was known as Coolie Town. Much as in India, let us not forget when you look at cities like Bombay, right now Mumbai, but Bombay as it was known for a very long period of time, that there was a dark town. And this is where all the Indians lived. And if you know lots of Indian cities, particularly in North India, you go to, for example, you go to Delhi, you go to Kanpur, you go to Meerut, cities such as that, they have a cantonment area, right? And that cantonment area was the area which was really for the British. It was for the military, but then you had the civil lines attached to that. And then you had the Indian part of town, which was very often called the Black Town. In South Africa, it was known as the Coolie Town. And it was in that part that this pneumonic plague broke out, right? And this is what Gandhi is really describing, that he is called there, and even though and there are these Indians, and so the first thing that Gandhi does is what? Think of it, right? He takes these Indians, he puts them in a vacant building. He's isolating them. He's isolating them. I mean, if you think about the coronavirus, that's exactly what you do. You quarantine people, you isolate them, right? Right? The following day, the local municipality made available a vacant, dirty warehouse, which they placed at Gandhi's disposal, leaving the Indians to clean the premises, haul beds into it, and turn it into a temporary hospital. The municipality lent the services of a nurse, whose name Gandhi did not recall years later when he wrote his books, but who has since been identified as Emily Blake, right? And Emily Blake's grandson today has done a lot of research, which I don't cite in this in great detail. I have a much longer piece where I discuss that, okay? Because the grandson of this nurse who dies, he says very clearly that in fact, Gandhi saved Johannesburg from the plague with his actions, right? I mean, he goes so far as to, as I said, really say that, all right? Now, but we have evidence from that period of time, because the following year, the year after the plague, an official account of the plague appeared under the name of the Johannesburg Plague Committee Report. There are only 2 or 3 surviving copies of this work in the world today. And this committee report suggests that neither Miss Blake nor any of the Indians, including Gandhi, that were providing care for the sick, were furnished any protective equipment, right? PPE, as it's called, personal protective equipment, or masks. They had none of that, right? The report tacitly recognizes the part played by Gandhi and another doctor, Dr. Godfrey, who was a physician practicing in Johannesburg, who had come to the aid of the Indians, and recognizes their role in raising the alarm and preventing the plague from taking hold in other parts of the city. Here, and I'm quoting now the report, because it's really quite extraordinary, you know, that you think about the role that it is, that this committee report, an official committee report produced by the British there, is ascribing to Gandhi. The value of, quote, isolating infected persons was immediately appreciated by Dr. Godfrey and Mahatma Gandhi, right? And progress was made before municipal authorities first realized that the epidemic was fully underway. Still another research essay, and that's the one I referred to by the relative of Emily Blake, the nurse who died. She was the only nurse to die there. Still another research essay is more pronounced in underscoring Gandhi's capacious understanding of the circumstances that had no small part in precipitating the plague among Indian indentured laborers, whose health in the best of conditions was feeble, and the role he played in bringing the epidemic under control. Delving into previously unexplored correspondence, Capone notices that since early February 1904, Gandhi had sought to bring to the attention of the chief officer for health for Johannesburg the extremely unsanitary conditions under which the Indians lived and the municipality's gross negligence in safeguarding their health. Writing to him on February 11th, Gandhi described, quote, the shocking state of the Indian location. Rooms appear to be overcrowded beyond description, and the sanitary services had deteriorated. From what I believe, Gandhi notes ominously, quote, I believe the mortality in the location has increased considerably, and it seems to me that if the present state of things continues, an outbreak of some epidemic disease is merely a question of time. Right, all right, end quote. Now, significant as Gandhi's interventions appear to have been to stem the rise of the plague in Johannesburg in 1904, his volunteer work during the Zulu rebellion is still more remarkable for what it reveals about the ethics of Gandhi's nursing. It is therefore necessary first to revisit his work on the battlefield in 1899 during the Boer War, to which I have adverted briefly. Um, Though there is an account of this in Gandhi's own writings, the apparent anomaly of him appearing as a nurse in aid of the British is also explored in what is possibly the most exhaustive history of the Boer War by the British historian Thomas Pakenham. And Pakenham here describes Gandhi, at the head of this corps, the 2,000 of these stretcher bearers, including 800 who were from Natal's Indian community, led by a 28-year-old barrister, that is Gandhi. And of course, the reason why Gandhi was willing to do this, because at this point in time, he held to the view that what Indians should aspire for is rights within the empire, within the British Empire. We know that his political views would change considerably many years down the road, right? The work is described, that is in the work that Gandhi himself did in the Boer War, by Gandhi in his own autobiography, but he gives barely 2 lines to it, barely 2 lines. At a critical moment, despite assurances that the ambulance corps would not be required to serve within the firing line, Gandhi and the 1,100 Indians, 800 of whom were still indentured. And I think, one can comment at very great length on that, right? That these Indians are indentured laborers. And I don't have the time right now to describe to you what it meant to be indentured, but indenture, Hugh Tinker, many years ago said was a different form of slavery, right? Because you're basically living, you're serving under a contract, and the conditions under which you were serving were usually miserable, right? Nonetheless, these people are contributing to the war effort, not on the battlefield physically by using arms, but physically on the battlefield by nursing the wounded, led by Gandhi, right? They accept this risk without hesitation. And Gandhi says during these days, we had to march from 20 to 25 miles a day, bearing the wounded on stretchers. Remarkably, Gandhi rendered his assistance to the British, as I've already suggested, though his own sympathies were with the Boers. As he explained in his autobiography, I felt that if I demanded rights as a British citizen, it was also my duty to participate in the defense of the British Empire. Now, less than 10 years later, Gandhi again found himself raising the Natal Volunteer Ambulance Corps, occasioned by what is known as the Zulu Rebellion. And this is the last set of incidents I'm going to describe before I move on to some concluding thoughts about the pandemic and what Gandhi might have done, all right? The year 1906, this is a very crucial year, okay, is recognized by scholars as a pivotal and doubtless a transformative moment in his life. He took a vow of celibacy and abjured all sexual relations, even with his wife, for the rest of his life. And this on the grounds that he had come to the conviction that procreation, I'm quoting him, that procreation and the consequent care of children were inconsistent with public service, end quote. Now, it is not possible at this juncture to delve into the intricacies of this decision, except to say that oddly enough, the many scholars who have probed the subject of Gandhi's views on sexuality have not considered the manner in which the vow came to fruition when he was nursing the wounded Zulus. So it was when he was nursing these wounded Zulus, Africans, it is at this time that Gandhi takes the vow of celibacy, right? And so there's a strange connection between nursing and celibacy, and even more strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, it echoes, of course, the views of Florence Nightingale herself, who remained celibate her whole life, remained single her whole life, and I think that she herself was actually very much of the view that if you were celibate, it was a way to render service more productively. The kind of service that she's speaking of, nursing care, rendering service to the public. All right. But I think the matter is more complex. 2 decades ago, in a lengthy paper on the politics of Gandhi's sexuality, I suggested, contrary to the still dominant view that Gandhi's outlook was characterized by an unhealthy and even repulsive form of sexual puritanism, that it is critical to distinguish, I argued, between his repudiation of the sexual act on the one hand, and on the other hand, his love of intimacy and sexuality. Sex and sexuality are not the same. When he took the vow of celibacy, Gandhi did not thereby abjure or give up touch, nor proximity to the bodies of others. Both, I would argue, entirely central to his conception of nursing, right? And I want you to think about touch, because what is it that we cannot do now? During the times of the coronavirus pandemic, we cannot touch others, right? We're asked to keep a distance of, 6 feet, right? And some of the most heartbreaking stories from all over the world is people who have died without their family, their friends being present because they cannot be close by, right? So we have to think about touch. I'm going to get back to it in a moment. But let us hear what Gandhi has to say further. He says, I was delighted on reaching headquarters to hear that our main work was to be the nursing of the wounded Zulus. The medical officer in charge welcomed us. He said white people were not willing nurses for the wounded Zulus, that their wounds were festering, and he was at his wit's end. He hailed our arrival as a godsend for these innocent people. And he equipped us with bandages, disinfectants, etc., and took us to the improvised hotel. The Zulus were delighted to see us, end quote. The festering wounds of which Gandhi speaks were a consequence of the floggings by which the Zulus were browbeaten into submission. These floggings had caused severe sores which had been left unattended. Their protocols of war prevented the British from tending to the wounded Zulus. And as we have seen, Gandhi remarks that white people were not willing nurses for the wounded Zulus. The white people wouldn't touch these Africans. So Gandhi, who had been appointed Sergeant Major of the Corps, commanded a number of men who assisted in tending to the wounded Zulus. Here he resumes his narrative, and I quote, the white soldiers used to peep through the railings that separate us from them and try to dissuade us from attending to the wounds. And as we would not heed them, they became enraged and poured unspeakable abuse on the Zulus, end quote. White people were unwilling to nurse the Zulus, but their voyeurism, but then they're peeping through. So it's their voyeurism as they peep through the railings while the Indians attended to the wounded men is glaring. Sight has been privileged among the senses, at least in the Western tradition, but Gandhi's conduct points to the phenomenological importance of touch in his worldview. And this is where I come back to COVID-19, because one of the greatest calamities of COVID-19 is that, contrary to what we are ordinarily called upon to do when confronted by a grave disaster, it demands of us, COVID demands of us, that we isolate ourselves from others, build fences, and forego the often intimate and unspeakably beautiful pleasures of touch, right? Your grandfather or grandmother is passing, the grandchild wants to touch them. It's that intimacy, that beautiful moment of touch that we are unable to engage in, right? So here what we have here also is we have a dialectic here where we have to think about the sensorium. We have to think about sight and touch and what is the relationship of the two, right? And why is it that in the Western tradition, I'm suggesting sight is elevated, and in the Indian tradition, actually it was touch. Even though in the Indian tradition, we also have the notion of darshan, right? The gaze, but that's a different realm that we're speaking about here. What is equally inescapable in the magnanimous ethics of hospitality behind the nursing of the Zulus is this. Though Gandhi craved to be accepted as a subject of the British Empire, he plunges headlong into nursing the empire's enemies. So what might Gandhi then have thought of the present pandemic, the jeopardy in which the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people around the world has been placed, the enormous toll it has taken of human lives, and even considering his own stated passion for nursing, of the advice of scientists and doctors that each one of us should practice social distancing, right? What would Gandhi have thought of this idea of social distancing? Before turning to this question, it is necessary to reflect on what would be obvious to most people. When Gandhi avers or refers to his passion for nursing or invokes the occasions when he felt called upon to nurse the wounded, he calls to mind a profession that over the course of the 20th century became heavily feminized. Heavily feminized. The feminist critique of nursing as a discourse, practice, and profession has not unreasonably has torn to shreds the assumption, one that is shared by Nightingale and Gandhi, that women have a natural aptitude for nursing, or that they are by nature, disposition, and training better suited to the care of the sick than men. Feminists have put into serious question the supposition that women are especially called upon to be self-sacrificing. Now, there is a large literature on the subject, but it suffices to introduce briefly only two considerations. First, there is no gainsaying the fact that Nightingale forcefully advocated for women as nurses rather than as doctors. But the feminist critique is perhaps not sufficiently mindful of the fact that even in mid-19th century Britain and Europe, nursing was scarcely a profession for women from respectable homes. We don't realize that. But for Florence Nightingale herself to go into nursing, was in fact in many ways quite revolutionary. Nursing was commonly left to those who came from impoverished families or those women engaged in prostitution. To this extent, Nightingale's endeavor was to make nursing open to respectable or educated women, introduce professional standards, furnish women with secure employment, and liberate women from the tyranny of the home. Secondly, Gandhi's own predilection for nursing can also profitably be viewed within the ambit of his larger design, both of feminizing the public sphere and, in practice, controverting the assigned gender roles that his own writings appear to endorse. The beginning point of a Gandhian view of the pandemic is perhaps to recognize that it would have been one with Nightingale in holding to the view that whatever a patient can do himself, it is better. He was very much his own doctor and a theorist of biopolitics, which placed the responsibility of well-being upon each individual and the state. He knew enough about public health and the importance of sanitation. As I have amply demonstrated by a discussion of his idea about the imminent advance of the plague, the fact that he writes to the municipality, castigates them, right, for not having taken action, and in fact actually accuses them of criminal neglect. This phrase criminal neglect is what he uses, which is of course exactly the same phrase of indictment I would use for the president of the United States. He's essentially guilty of criminal neglect in the way in which he's handled the coronavirus pandemic. Right? But on the issue of social distancing, Gandhi would likely have displayed some ambivalence. While he would have been critical of the reckless disregard for the lives of others manifested in the behavior of those who are unable to look beyond their own wants, comforts, and drives, it is inconceivable that he would have not found it disconcerting and unacceptable that some are hiding behind the excuse of the pandemic to shun their neighbors, to introduce new hierarchies and drive a wedge between themselves and others whom they imagine are their social inferiors. Social distancing, we have to be aware, can create its own forms of ghettoization. Gandhi held to the view that there are laws of compensation at work in this universe, however opaque they may be to us. The comparatively clean air in the wake of the shuttering of the world economy, for example, is perhaps a sign to human beings to be mindful of the devastation they have wrought upon planet Earth. But Gandhi was not only one to philosophize. It is impossible to imagine him not present on the scene, tending to the sick and comforting members of their families. Even as his compassion was known to be boundless, nowhere more was this in evidence than in the fearless walk that he undertook through riot-torn Noakhali just months before his assassination, comforting the afflicted while accepting the taunts of some as though they were bouquets of flowers. Gandhi was also tough as nails. And I suspect that he would have punished himself to the hilt in working around the clock, organizing relief workers and cajoling people not to rely on government handouts, but to make themselves useful and apply their ingenuity. Gandhi did not require a pandemic to discover, as is true of many of us, if not all of us, that many of those who are among the lowest paid workers are in fact the most essential. His relentless critique of industrial modernity has led many people into believing that Gandhi was opposed to science, but this is far from being the case. He was a scientist in his own fashion. In fact, he's writing Hind Swaraj really as a scientific treatise from his standpoint, ceaselessly testing the truth of every proposition, but more critically, he was opposed to scientism. Right? Scientism here being the view that whatever problems science has created will also be resolved by science. That's something that Gandhi never accepted. He said you have to step outside that framework, right? While he would have respected scientific advice, I think it can safely be said that Gandhi would have also said that we cannot leave our understanding of the pandemic and its social, political, and philosophical implications to the scientists alone, because the pandemonium engendered by the pandemic is ultimately a reflection of the unrest within each of us and within Homo sapiens as a whole. Magnificent as the nurses have been in tending to the sick and the diseased, we are all called upon to nurse this earth back to health. Something which can only begin with the recognition that as a species, we are likely less essential than we have imagined ourselves to be. So thank you. I conclude with that. But before I turn it over to the chair or the moderator, and then for questions, I just want to very briefly share a screen with you, which is to just show you 5 or 6 images. I just want to make sure, are people able to see the screen? Can the screen be seen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. So let me just show some of the images here. So this, by the way, is the book which will be released next week. My book, The Fury of COVID-19: The Politics, Histories, and Unrequited Love of the Coronavirus. And a very, very small portion of this, literally 7-8 pages is the presentation I've given today. The lecture I've given today is a much more extensive version of that. This is the book I was referring to by Florence Nightingale, Notes on Nursing, published in 1860. Of course, this is a reprint edition, What It Is and What It Is Not, which became sort of the main manual in a way. As I've already suggested to you, there is no evidence that Gandhi actually knew this work. Also on the subject of Florence Nightingale, who's basically viewed as the founder of the whole profession of nursing. Some of you may be aware that she did extensive work on India, extensive work. She never visited India, but her writings on India have been collected in 2 massive volumes of about 1,000 pages each, because she was primarily responsible for the reforms, sanitation reforms, particularly within the army, which also included such things as regulation of brothels and all of that. But she was fundamentally interested in social reform movements in India and the question of sanitation, irrigation, nutrition, and all of that. She wrote voluminously on these subjects, all right. And here is, of course, a photograph of Gandhi from his South African years, from the Natal Corps that he raised. And this, where my cursor is, this is Gandhi over here. This is one of the more well-known photographs. This photograph is almost entirely unknown. This is when Gandhi was released. So this is not related to the talk, but it's from the period. This is from Johannesburg. This is when he was released from prison. You see him over here, third from the left over here, outside the prison in Johannesburg. And this is in 1908. And this here, this image over here, is a page view in Johannesburg. This is one of the areas where Indians were settled, because the particular coolie lines I was speaking about, where the plague had broken out and where Gandhi nursed the Indians back to health, and possibly, at least according to Capon, saved the city of Johannesburg from the epidemic because he prevented it from spreading. The area where the Indians were staying, Coolie Town, was burnt down by the city, by the municipality, because it was seen as being a place that was unsanitary, and the Indians were shunted around here and there, and eventually they wound up at this place, and they were then thrown out of here. When apartheid became the official policy of South Africa in 1949, and that meant that areas were segregated strictly by race and color. So, this area, the Indians were evacuated from here. And this is the last image here. And with that, I conclude my talk. And this is an image which shows Gandhi tending to, this is the person here. This is, again, a very famous photograph. This is Parchure, and he was a major social worker, but he also suffered from leprosy. And Gandhi tended to his care. This is significant because not only in India, but throughout the world, there was always a dread of the leper, a dread of the leper. If in the West, if you read the Old Testament, if you read Leviticus, the third book of Moses, there's already a discussion there of, the kind of panic into which people were thrown by the idea of leprosy, right? And Gandhi, of course, fearless as always, never had any hesitation in tending to the ill, the wounded, or the lepers. And with that, I stop. Thank you very much.
We begin with some of the questions. Thank you, sir. You have taken us right from Gandhi's childhood days to his work in South Africa and his work in India concerning nursing, his thoughts on nursing, and also giving us an idea about what Gandhi would have thought and did during the present times. The first question is by Varsha Shenoy. How far did Gandhi revise and recast the conventional notion of nursing as feminine obligation or vocation or sphere?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Should I take each question as it comes, or are you going to give me related questions, or should I just address each question as you give it to me?
Can I give you a set of 3 questions?
Okay. Okay.
Second is, Gandhi's ideals of nursing were not totally divorced from the institution of modern medicine. Could you please reflect on this?
Mm-hmm.
The third question is by the second question is also by Varsha. I'm sorry to take 2 questions by one person itself. The second question is by Somashekarappa. Almost all life-threatening problems on the earth we are facing today, including COVID-19, are borderless. The solutions to all these problems demand borderless, non-violent global cooperation and collaboration, I feel. But we are witnessing more and more nationalistic, dictatorial, imperialistic, dominating type of tendencies throughout the globe. Your comments, please.
Yes.
So 3.
Yeah. So let me take these 3 questions. All good questions. Let me begin with the last one. I mean, I think hinted at this right at the outset, because some of you may recall that I had mentioned that slowly all over the world, we are creeping towards a kind of totalitarianism, ethno-nationalism, xenophobia, right? So
Yashwant Dongre.
This is something I'm well aware of, and that's something that I write on extensively. There are different ways in which one could address this. So one of the ways in which I'm going to address this is by trying to keep the question within the ambit of the talk. So for example, in the case of the coronavirus, because one way to think of the question is, well, what is the place of nonviolence? Well, that's of course a very large question, right? I mean, and I started by saying that one of the problems with nonviolence, the way we think about it, is that we only think of it in the context of conflict. And that's why I mentioned the figures of people like, let's say, Nelson Mandela, Ahmed Kathrada in South Africa, Oliver Tambo, many others. Or let's say Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, James Farmer, all of these people in the civil rights movement, the Dalai Lama, right? These are all cases which arise from a situation of conflict. But the fundamental issue is, how do we think about nonviolence, not just within the context of conflict, but how do we think of it as a way of being in the world? Now, that is obviously an enormous question, because that involves questions of pedagogy. It involves questions of how we bring up our children, how we bring ourselves up, how we conduct ourselves. Why is it that we have gravitated in so many parts of the world, to these forms of ethno-nationalism and so on? We would also have to bring our whole narrative of capitalism. Why is it that we have no alternative discourse anymore? We simply don't. Right? There are different ways in which we can speak about capitalism, but they're all essentially speaking the same language. When we speak the language of the market economy, when we speak about neoliberalization, we're speaking the language of capitalism. So all of those considerations have to be, because of course, would have to be brought into the picture, because there's no question in my mind that things like capitalism or neoliberalization policies have unquestionably contributed to the modern malaise, to our times. All right, that's the way in which we might. But within the context of the pandemic, let's look at it this way. Let's think about the possibilities of international cooperation. So what did we have? What we have is an organization called the WHO, the World Health Organization. Now there are problems. So I have a whole chapter in my book on the coronavirus on the WHO. The part of the problems have to do with the structure of the WHO, and this is not a bureaucratic or managerial problem I'm talking about, that the WHO was set up in a different time to deal with a different conception of disease. See, that is why their polio eradication, drives have been very successful. All right. Of course, the most successful international campaign that the WHO conducted was the eradication of smallpox. And India was a big part of that, because India was the last remaining outpost for smallpox in the world. And smallpox was, to use the military metaphor, conquered. And the WHO played a substantial role in that. But the WHO was not set up to deal with the kind of diseases that these pathogens, which have escaped these reservoirs of nature upon which human beings have now encroached, right? It is not set up to deal with this. And then, of course, we would have to look at the international politics. We know what Trump did. He rubbished the WHO immediately. And China, for its part, has unquestionably not been honest. And this is not the first time. I can give you an absolute assurance on that. Because when SARS happened, and what we have now is SARS-2, basically. So it's the same kind of family of viruses that we're really talking about. All right. When SARS happened, 2002-3, and again it broke out in China. And China obfuscated the truth. This is on record. All right. So even there, we are going to have to reimagine our international organizations and the international infrastructure through which we will think about problems of this magnitude. That's my answer, to number 3. Now, number 2 and number 1. So towards the end of my talk, going to the first question, which is a very good question. And towards the end of it, I did address it specifically, which is because, of course, I'm well aware of the politics of gender that we would have to think about. See, nursing is unquestionably one of those professions which has been heavily feminized, heavily feminized. And I have to say, by the way, that was not always the case. That was not always the case. We have to know the history of nursing. Because initially, as I mentioned, in the 19th century, women, if they went into nursing at all, came from lower class families. And they came, and very often these women were prostitutes, not always. All right? So when Florence Nightingale goes into it, a respectable woman from a respectable home, I'm using the language of those times, because that doesn't mean that I think prostitutes are not respectable. I'm not making that argument. I'm saying that that was a dominant view at that time, right? That for someone to like her to go into it was in fact actually quite radical, because it was mainly men who were nurses, all right? And particularly in situations of war, unquestionably so, you know. Now, when we get to Gandhi, see, Gandhi, if you read what he says, he seems very conventional, because he talks about the gender division of labor, that women's place is basically in the home. The man goes outside, works outside the home, brings home the bread, so to speak, etc., etc. Right? We're familiar with that. I don't have to elaborate upon it. But what is striking about Gandhi is that if you look at his practices, he cut that distinction down completely. And this is where we have to begin to see what exactly is really going on. Why is it that, for example, that Gandhi is much more attentive to the idea that in India, it is the action by which you will be judged. So we have to bring in, we have to distinguish between orthodoxy and orthopraxy here, all right? If you look at the ashram, and there are hundreds of accounts, hundreds, that have been written of how his ashrams are organized, the men and the women both worked on the same tasks. The men worked in the kitchen as well. The women cleaned the toilets as much as the men did. That's how the labor was divided. He was very well aware of the fact that this was a feminized profession, and this is one of the reasons why what he is doing. So he might say that, well, you know, women are better at nursing. He might say that. That's the pronouncement. But through his own personal practice, he was constantly undermining that. And I have to remind everyone here that when he forms the ambulance corps twice in South Africa, right? The Boer War and then the Zulu Rebellion, it is all men. All of the nurses who work with them are men. It was not the women, because of course it wasn't common for women to go into the public domain at all. Right? And this is not just true of Indians there in South Africa, it's true of the whites as well, because in the Boer War, the ambulance corps was 2,000 people and only 800 were Indians. The rest were actually white men, right? So is it the case that Gandhi reified actually gender? The answer is no, he didn't, you know, right? That would be my submission. But the question is very good because in the talk itself, of course, I mentioned this explicitly, but I didn't elaborate upon it at very great length. And then the second question there the question is that, is it really the case that Gandhi's ideals of nursing are really divorced from modern medicine? Well, we have to understand what we mean by modern, because you see, we would have to make a split in modern medicine between two things. One is what we might describe as pharmaceutical and surgical interventions. Now, that part of it, Gandhi was very critical of. But one of the things that has led to the making of modern medicine is the greater attentiveness to certain kinds of protocols having to do with sanitation, hygiene, nutrition, diet. And these all commence with nursing, which is why Florence Nightingale's little manual, Notes on Nursing, what it is, there are entire chapters on such things as ventilation. That, it'll be a lot better for patients if we learn how to ventilate the rooms and when the rooms should be ventilated and when they should not. Importance of sunlight, importance of diet. She has 4 pages in this slim book about the diet. So in that sense, yes, I agree that it's not divorced nursing, but when I'm critiquing and when Gandhi is critiquing modern medicine, what we're really speaking about is the pharmaceutical and surgical interventions and the principles of vivisection, division, cutting up, experiment, okay, having guinea pigs, so to speak. This is only the beginning. And that's why this paper is not an exploration of a whole critique of modern medicine, the epistemological critique. And that's why I also gave a reference, that extraordinary philosophically complex article on modern medicine and its non-modern critics. All right, so I think that I have addressed all 3 questions that were given to me.
We move on to the next 3.
Yes.
First one is by Yashwanta Dongre. How relevant today is Gandhi's idea of self-reliance, and how different is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Atmanirbhar Bharat from that of Gandhi's self-reliant India?
Yeah.
Second, Dr. Lata Pandit asks, it is only the state which is equipped to design strategies for dealing with COVID. Do you feel that this should be seen as authoritarian state? Do we have an alternative? That's the second question. Third question is by Anita Rao. The missionary zeal for public service did not evolve and consolidate in the Indian canvas in spite of Buddha or Basavanna. Your comments, sir.
Okay, wonderful question. The third one in particular, all are very good questions, but let me begin with the first one. The notion of self-reliance that Gandhi has and that our Prime Minister has. I don't want to be, unkind to our Prime Minister, but there is no comparison, frankly, at all, even remotely, because, when you're speaking of Gandhi, you're thinking of a different order of thinking and creativity in the, not just in the Indian context, but in the global context. All right. Our Prime Minister doesn't have a single original idea because he's not a person who's given to thinking to begin with. And in fact, I'm going to so far as to say I have no hesitation in laying bare what my views are, that the present government we have is not a government that is given to reflection of any kind. These are not people who read or think. Right? That is the fundamental postulate with which we have to begin when we're really looking at the state of affairs in our country. And we have to begin at that level of generality. Last year when I was in India, I'm in India 4 times a year. So, I pick up dozens and hundreds of books when I'm there every time. And so I was at the airport on my way back, and I'm at the checkout counter. I had gotten a bottle of water at the W.H. Smith shop at the airport. And there's a book authored by Narendra Modi. So I said, let me pick it up. It's called Exam Warriors. This is a book for 5-year-old children. It's, exam dene se pehle achhi neend karni chahiye. It's advice to children. You should sleep well. 40 pages of yoga exercises, the importance of posture when you sit down. Right? That's the level that we're really speaking about. And this is the regime that has been blasting away at Nehru. If you read what Nehru writes, it's a different level of thinking altogether that we're really speaking about. So when we're speaking about self-reliance, for Gandhi, see, for a Prime Minister, these are slogans. They're just slogans. This is politics. This is Gandhi. This is not politics. What you're really speaking about is a whole set of ideas that he gives you about how to be self-reliant yourself, the self-reliance of the nation, of the community, what that really means, okay? What we are called upon to do in order to strive towards that kind of self-reliance. And that means we have to first understand the notion of the self, which is why, let's just go back for a moment. Hind Swaraj, the title of the book, Hind Swaraj, Swaraj, right? Self-rule. But if you're only 3 pages into the book, you realize, and remember that the subtitle is Or Indian Home Rule, that this is not just a book about home rule, right? As Annie Besant also used to call it, that is self-determination or independence of the British from India. It is about how one governs one's own self, right? And what is the relationship between governing one's own self, which is why he has all these chapters that appear eccentric to people. Why is he talking about doctors and lawyers and all of that? Why is he critiquing them? Because what he's saying is that all of these are modes in which we lose control of ourselves first, right? So I regret to say, with all due respect to people who think differently here, that any kind of comparison between the two is absolutely uncalled for, right? I think we have to be absolutely unequivocally clear about that. Second question has to do with state intervention, the question of the state authoritarianism. Very important question. Because, and again, I can view it within the Gandhian framework, I can view it outside the Gandhian framework as well. But if you view it in the generality first, political theory has long thought about the whole question of the state. What is the place of the state, the relationship of the state to the individual, notions of autonomy. And living in the United States and also thinking about Gandhi, one of the things that is inescapably clear to me, for example, is that just as in the US, there is a deep suspicion of the state in many ways. I have to say that Gandhi himself had a deep suspicion of the state. He did. In that sense, he would be very different from some of the kinds of social workers and activists that we have today who call for state intervention in everything. Because of course, Gandhi understood that the state is the guarantor of your rights. Unfortunately, it is also the greatest oppressor of your rights. And that has been shown repeatedly in one country after another, and in one decade and one century after another. Throughout history, it has been shown. And that is one reason why he had a very profound suspicion of the state. So one of the issues that has come up with the coronavirus is that, is it going to the way, see, I started out by saying that one of the things that makes it very distinct from all the pandemics, because somebody might say, well, you know, look, you had the Black Death, the mortality rate in the Black Death in the 14th century was much higher. Yes, absolutely. The Black Death wiped out 1/3 of the population of Europe. Okay, 1/3 of the population of Europe. Mortality rates were astounding, you know. So someone might say, well, why am I saying that this pandemic is unprecedented? And I've made it very clear that one of the reasons, principal reasons why it's absolutely unprecedented is because we do not have on record anywhere in the world from any point in the past this kind of concerted state intervention, not even during wars. In World War II, the English pubs were open. You know, the Nazis would have this blitzkrieg, they'd have these planes, constant bombardment, right? And the people go into the tube, as it's called, that is the underground subway. For those of you who've been in London, you know exactly what I mean. And some of the stations are way down, right? And you know, when the siren sounded, it's all clear, you come out and you go straight to the pub. Now what's happened is everything was shut down for a period of 2 months. The entire world was in a way shut down. Yes, of course, there's online shopping going on and that kind of thing. But what I'm talking about is museums, schools, universities, public offices, streets, everything is vacated. This is because of the extraordinary amount of concerted state intervention. And here I haven't even spoken about airline traffic, because we cannot think about the coronavirus without thinking about its drivers. And the fundamental driver is really the aircraft, right? Which is why the virus has extended to the remotest islands. There are even cases in the Andaman Islands. So all of you in India, I think, would know that if you've been reading the newspapers. There are even cases in the Andaman Islands of coronavirus, all right? So this question of state intervention is very critical, because on the one hand, we are in a situation where it appears that we may need some level of state intervention in order globally, in order to think about how we're going to resolve this issue over a period of time. On the other hand, the problem is that states everywhere are using the pretext of the pandemic to put down dissent. Everywhere. India is no exception. And I won't get into the details, but I think all of you will know exactly what I mean, right? And then finally, I think the third question, I think I forgot to write down the whole question. It was something about missionary zeal for something. Sorry, please excuse me, I don't remember. Can you repeat the question again?
I'll repeat the question. This is by Anita Rao. The missionary zeal for public service did not evolve and consolidate
Yes.
in the
Yes.
Indian canvas in spite of Buddha or Basavanna. Your comment?
Yes. Yeah.
Sir, if you can take these remaining two more last questions, because we are going to close at 12:30.
Yeah.
If you can take two more questions. One is
Okay.
by Parinita.
Yeah.
He says, if touch is the most intimate way in which bodies interact, and if touch is always regulated by protocols of social and institutional spaces that bodies occupy, do you think that this pandemic has scrambled these protocols of touch and demanded of us radically new ways of bodily interaction and recognition? The next
Yes.
and the last one is by Manu Sharma. He would like to know the inconsistent, contradicting nature of Mr. Gandhi on professional healthcare. Mr. Gandhi preferred naturopathy, hydropathy, earth treatment, fasting, dietetics to modern medical intervention, even in the
Yes.
case of his beloved wife, Gandhi chose palliative care
Even in the
instead of
case of what,
aggressive
sorry?
medicine.
Hello? I can't hear.
Now, can you hear, sir?
Now I can. Yeah, I think you got cut off for about 15 seconds.
Yes, even in the case of his beloved wife, Gandhi chose palliative care instead of aggressive medical intervention. And
Yes.
also would like to know about your Gandhi's teaching, which urges to take vow of chastity for essential health, and also his views on illness as embodiment of sin.
Yeah, right. Once again, let me say, very good questions, all of them. I have done about 6-7 webinars, all on entirely different subjects. One on Gandhi and African Americans, one on Gandhi and Palestine, and so on. This is the best set of questions I've received, I have to say. Very thoughtful questions, all of them. But let me begin with the first of the three, and that was that the missionary zeal for public service, notwithstanding the fact that we have had in our past such figures as Basavana and the Buddha, and of course then Gandhi, that this idea of public service never really took off, you know. And I have to say that in general, I would agree. Although I would have to add this caveat that we would have to study the pre-colonial past much more carefully and intensively in order to understand whether that was really the case. But prima facie, at least if we look at it from the vantage point of today, and I say vantage point of today rather than the 19th century, because unfortunately, when you get to the 19th century, then you are reliant upon colonial records. And that doesn't mean that I hold the view that all colonial records are necessarily contaminated. But then you also get such things as Catherine Mills. Of course, it's not a colonial record, but it's from the colonial period, needless to say. And when you look at her book, Mother India, her very controversial book, which is really a wholesale indictment of everything in Indian society, part of that indictment was precisely what is suggested in this question, namely that we don't have a notion of public service. So I think that we would now have to, in order to understand that, I mean, it's not going to be possible for me to elaborate my views at full length here for obvious reasons. But I would suggest that we have to begin with, other than what I've said, we would have to begin with two considerations. And the first is we'd have to consider the idea of self and what kind of boundaries we place upon the self and what kind of responsibilities we assume for those outside those boundaries, right? That is, it seems to me, a fundamental problem in India and in Indian thought. That, and it's been noted by many people. And when you go to the colonial period, one of the things that even colonial observers noted, whether they were travelers or whether it was colonial administrators and officials, whole spectrum of people representing that standpoint. But what they all noted very often was that if you stepped foot inside an Indian's home, it was immaculately clean. Even the poorest hut seemed to many people to be very clean. But the minute you step outside that hut in the public domain, it was absolutely filthy, which is a problem that is found in India even today, all the time, right? So in order to understand that, we have to understand the self and how we frame a boundary around the self, right? And what happens to those who fall outside that boundary. The second thing is, there is a long history that many of these, there is a, you see, if we're looking at public health, the public health has two components. One is what people do themselves. And that's the first part of it that I've addressed. The second is what the state does. Right? I mean, if you look, for example, let's just broaden it out for a moment. If you look at the United States, for example, now when we talk about the West, we mean, of course, Europe and the US, Australia, Canada, the white world as well, right? So fundamentally, we are speaking about a common template there. But there is a fundamental difference between the social welfare states of Europe today, or Western Europe today, and the United States. Right? The kind of public health, attentiveness to public health that you have in Sweden or Norway, and not just the Scandinavian countries, all over Western Europe, more pronounced in the Scandinavian countries, the kind of attentiveness we have to public health there, we simply do not have in the United States, which is one reason why it's the absolute decline of public health and the state's intervention there, that is the state providing resources, which is, of course, also in the US completely lopsided because certain communities, such as Black communities and Native Americans, for example, do not get those services. Or if they get them in an extremely watered down version, right? So this is the second part of that. And part of the reason has to do with the suspicion of the state. Now, that is that the state never really was there for the people in India. I think that this is a fundamental proposition that I would really put before you. And certainly, 18th, 19th century and thereafter, that's the case. One of the things I love is to study is the Hindi cinema. That's where when I was introduced, one of my books was mentioned, Diwar, based on, of course, a famous 1975 film with Amitabh and Shashi Kapoor. and that famous, dialogue that takes place under the bridge, mere paas maa hai, right? That which is now part and parcel of the Indian imagination, because there have been thousands of parodies and all of that. But the Hindi film is very interesting to look at, because in the Hindi film of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I can't tell you how many films there were, thousands, where the police always arrive too late. That is, a hero has caught the villain on his own, bashed him up to pieces, and and then at that moment, the state arrives. They were completely absent before. They just arrived to put the handcuffs, and then the end, right? Why does the state always arrive so late? That's what I'm trying to really talk about, is this, that the state was never really there, in a way. All right, so these are the two components. Now, there was a question about the last question, and then there's a question in between, but let me take the last question, because I'm not going to say much about it, because I really have talked about it a bit, and then again, we'll have to really talk at very great length, and we'd have to look at what Gandhi thought about naturopathy, what was his view of fasting. The view of fasting is so complex here that it is not possible for me to, because it is not simply a matter of abstention from food, which of course, by the way, is recommended in many cultures. I mean, why is it that after all, if you come down with dysentery or diarrhea or any number of other problems, what is the simplest solution? The simplest solution is stop eating. Stop eating for 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours. That's the simplest cure. And then from there you can move. All right, so if you need some nourishment, so very simple, plain boiled rice with dahi, curds, right? But fasting and the whole phenomenology and the philosophy of fasting is extraordinarily complex. Because why do we have a long tradition of it in India? All right, what is the gendered aspect of it? For example, the women fasted, but those were considered domestic fasts. They fast for the family. Then you have these public fasts, and Gandhi is not the first person to do it. There's a long tradition of that. But he is the one who transforms that tradition. All right. Then what is the relationship of fasting to the anthropology of the body, for example? We'd have to look at all of that. So it's impossible for me to really look at naturopathy, homeopathy, fasting, all of these different things and say, well, what were Gandhi's views really about this? And how does one really think of this in totality in relationship to Gandhi? What kind of treatment he subjected himself to, and as was mentioned in the question, that Kasturba, his wife, was subjected to as well, right? But I'm giving just a few entry points here that, for example, taking fast as an illustration, that we'd have to start thinking about it in really very complex ways, And then finally, there was the question in between, and that was a question of, it's a fascinating question, but it's going to require a lot of thought. And I have to confess, I haven't really fully thought through it, the whole question of touch, because the question has another component of it that, do we have to start thinking about radical new ways of imagining the place of the senses and the body? And that is really fundamentally what the question is. Are we going to get suspicious about touch, for example? Well, one thing, of course, we have to keep in mind is that the experience of one generation is only that. That is that memory is very short. I mean, how many people remember today in America where people are protesting masks, and now these same protests are taking place in Germany for the last several weeks, actually, and in several other countries as well. In some places, people are not so much protesting, they're just not wearing them, right? But how many people remember, almost no one, that these debates actually took place in 1918 during the so-called Spanish flu? They did. There's no question about it. I know the literature. I can point you to it. These debates took place No one remembers them. No one even remembered them in the 1950s and 1968 when you had the Hong Kong flu, or when you had SARS, or when you had the avian flu, the swine flu, H1N1. So one could go on in that context, right? So it is not, the question is important because yes, I think the situation calls for radical new ways of reimagining many things, our relationships, the institutions, uh, and certainly with respect to this question, the whole question of touch. Will we become fearful about touching? What happens to the handshake? Some people have said, for example, well, I don't think it's going to disappear at all. I mean, there's only so many elbow touches you can do, really, frankly, or something else. But what may happen is that we may become more reflective about, for example, the cultural history of the handshake. If I ask people, what is the cultural history of the handshake? When did it originate? In which culture did it originate? What are the circumstances under which it originated? If we become more reflective about all of those things, that itself can produce some new forms of thinking. Right? So I'll conclude my thoughts with that.
Sir, with your due permission, is it possible for us to take another two questions? Professor
Well,
Tolpur?
yeah, I mean, the thing is that, look, I may, because it's getting a bit late here. And I have actually, I mean, I'm a person who writes at night, so I have another obligation, which I have to fulfill tonight before I go to bed. It's already 12:10, and we've gone well beyond the appointed time. So with regrets, I think that I would like to decline that request, if you don't mind, because it is 12:10 a.m. here in Los Angeles,
Sure, sir.
Yeah. Yeah.
We conclude with a brief vote of thanks.
Gratitude makes sense of
makes sense of our past, brings peace for today, and creates a vision for tomorrow. Therefore, I would take this moment to thank all those who have been a part of this successful webinar. Firstly, I would like to thank the President of the day, Dr. Pravin Martis S.J., the Principal, St. Aloysius College, Mangalore, for his constant support and guidance. I'm also grateful to Professor P.S. Edapaditaya, the Vice Chancellor of Mangalore University, who is the cornerstone of today's webinar. Thank you, sir. I acknowledge my sincere gratitude to Professor Vinay Lal, an eminent historian and Gandhi scholar, University of California, Los Angeles, for spending your precious time and giving us insight on Gandhi and the ethics of nursing, a pedagogy of care in times of coronavirus. Thank you, sir. I'm grateful to Dr. Norbert Lobo, the Director of Admin Block, Dr. Rosvira D'Souza, Dean of Arts Faculty, HOD of Political Science Department, the organizers, Ms. Maria Shaila D'Souza, Mr. Alvin D'Souza, and Dr. Joyce Lobo from the Department of Political Science, and Mr. Dinesh Naik and all the members of Arts Faculty, St. Aloysius College, and from Nehru Study Center for organizing this webinar and toiling tirelessly for its success. I thank Professor Rajaram Tolpadi, Director in Charge, Nehru Study Center, Bangalore University, and Ms. Nayana for your coordination and also for moderating this session. I'm thankful to Dr. Divya Shetty from the PG Department of Chemistry and Mr. Ruben from the Department of Journalism for your rendition. I express my gratitude to Dr. Ronald Nazareth from the Department of Chemistry for facilitating Zoom platform, Mr. Royal D'Souza and Ms. Satish Nayak from the Department of Computer Science for your technical assistance and digital support. I am also grateful to Mr. Godwin Coelho and Mr. Anil from the Maintenance Department for your cooperation. I thank Ms. Ria Montero for meticulously hosting this webinar. Last but not the least, I thank you all for taking active part in this webinar. Participants, kindly note the feedback form. Link of the feedback form is put in the chat box. So kindly fill in your details and submit it, and you will receive your certificates within 1 week from now. Thank you one and all. Have a great year. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you very much.
Professor Tolpudi.
Thank you. Thank you, Vinay. Thank you, sir.
So,
Yeah.
Professor Tolpudi would like to
Yeah,
thank you,
yeah.
Professor Vinay Lal.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Vinay, for an interesting presentation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Professor Tolpadi, and I hope to remain in touch with you. Bye-bye, all of you.